So yeah, bear with me because I've never done a webinar before, so I'm a little nervous, but let's see how this goes. So the Matilda Centre, or formerly in our capacity as CREMS, over a 13-year period conducted 6 large-scale RCTs of universal prevention interventions. Together, they have included over 16,000 Generation Z Australians, followed throughout adolescence. These trials have been groundbreaking in their own right, as we know, and they've made invaluable contributions to the knowledge in the area of universal prevention interventions for substance use and mental health. And they've resulted in the release of programs that are improving outcomes for young people Australia-wide. But what if there was something else we could do with this data? What if we're sitting on the largest longitudinal study of adolescent mental health and substance use in Australia's history? This was the question that prompted my Master of Public Health capstone project. Apples with apples, measurement consistency and comparability in the evaluation of adolescent prevention interventions. Now, just to flag up front, I actually submitted this last May, so there have been a few updates since I submitted it. Notably the development of the Strong and Deadly Futures questionnaire and the CSC long-term follow-up questionnaire, which won't be included in the stuff I talk about today, but that really just adds more opportunities in this space. So by way of background, as we all know that in health research over recent years, there's been a trend towards the use of big data and an increasing push for large-scale studies that capture inter-individual and intra-individual change over time. It often isn't possible to capture this within a single study due to the burden and costs involved, which has led to a growing focus on what's called data harmonisation. In data harmonisation, multiple different data sets are combined. And if they're longitudinal data sets, like in the case of most of our trials, this allows for that inter-individual and intra-individual comparison. Now, whilst it's possible to harmonise data sets that have utilised different measure tools, measure commonality allows for significantly more efficient and reliable harmonisation. There are 2 types of harmonisation, really, that I'll be talking about today. And the first is referred to as prospective harmonisation, which is when harmonisation is planned from the outset. So a questionnaire is designed, usually in collaboration with other data, like other questionnaire planning, in order to harmonise in the future. And then there is retrospective harmonisation, which basically involves opportunistic identification of measured commonality in existing data sets. And then these existing data sets then present an opportunity for conducting a well-powered secondary analysis that can uncover invaluable insights into rare events or trends over time that might not be captured with a single data set. So the aims of this project, I aim to facilitate both retrospective and prospective harmonisation of data sets from the Matilda Centre Universal Prevention Trials. So firstly, I aim to identify opportunities for secondary analysis of existing data sets from the most recent trials in this space. But secondly, I aim to develop a resource that would ensure that trial teams would be able to plan for future harmonisation by utilising consistent measures. So if you're part of the many people at Matilda Centre who don't work in the prevention space per se, there's still a lot of opportunities with the work in this project for you. So stay tuned. So in order to harmonise existing data sets or plan for harmonisation, it's necessary to know some key details about the data set. So the first 2 stages of this project were pretty much a huge data extraction process where I collated information on the 6 most recent universal prevention trials from the Matilda Centre. So that was Health for Life. At this stage, it was Health for Life, CSP, CSC, CAP, CSI, and the alcohol and cannabis trial from climate schools. So in the first stage, I extracted the sample characteristics and names of all of the measures used in each of these 6 trials. Then after that, I conducted a detailed audit of the measures for the 3 most recent trials. So this involved basically extracting the exact wording used for the measures in the trial questionnaires, especially noting the time frame that participants were asked to recall if it was a self-report measure. So such as like in the past 4 weeks, how often did XYZ? So then in stage 3 and 4, I really focused on information that would be required to facilitate prospective harmonisation. So in stage 3, I reviewed the published literature for validation studies of the measures that have been used in our existing Matilda Centre data sets. From there, I extracted and collated the psychometric properties where they were reported to assist in justification of measure choice down the track. And also I tracked down the papers where the original item banks could be located and cited. So stage 4, I won't really talk about in this presentation because it was sort of its own mini project. But it was born from the insight that really for best practice in questionnaire design and thus best practice in prospective harmonisation planning, really you would conduct a literature review or a narrative review of all of the available measures for a particular outcome of interest to select a measure that has been not only validated in a similar sample, but also demonstrates acceptable psychometric properties and also might present opportunities for harmonisation. So as part of that stage, I did a review of screen time measures. But again, I won't kind of go into that too much today. So as part of this project, I wanted to actually compile all of this extracted information into one resource that could be used by all Matildas in a range of contexts. And so this was where the MMCat was born, or the Matilda Measure Catalogue. So this can be accessed via the link on the screen, and we'll send it around as a follow-up. And over the coming slides, you'll see a few screen grabs from the MMCat. But basically, it's pretty much a beast of a spreadsheet. So I've summarised some of the key information on this slide. And to make it a bit easier on the eyes, I've added some actual cats. So the information extracted from the internal document review, so looking at our own papers and files in our RDS. I extracted the variable measures, measured the measure chosen for the measures chosen for each Matilda trial, the item wording, as I've said, any modifications to the item wording in the original measure, the time points and the sample size and age at each time point. And then, as I said, from the published literature, there are the psychometric properties of the measure and the item bank. Now, Kath Chapman had an awesome idea, which I've stolen, so all credit to her. But given this is our first Zoom seminar and the temptation to check emails or do, various other mundane tasks like shopping for toilet paper on Woolworths online is strong. So to keep you engaged, there is a little challenge to see if you can count the number of feline friends that are featured throughout this presentation. And anyone who gets it right doesn't get a tangible prize, but gets lots of approval, especially from the Matilda executive. So what did I find throughout all of this data extraction and compiling? So as you can see in this table, in total, these 6 trials collected or will have collected data from nearly 16,000 Australian 13-year-olds over a 13-year period spanning from 2007 to 2020. Now, all of these studies also had 2 or more data collection time points, meaning that participants can be tracked longitudinally into later adolescence. So overall, there's close to 55,000 data points. You can see in the study cohort birth year column here that we have data from 13-year-old participants that were born from as early as 1994 to as late as 2007. So this is spanning nearly the whole of Generation Z. So this represents a huge opportunity for retrospective harmonisation. And as we talked about, this is only going to grow with the addition of Strong and Deadly Futures, the CSC long-term follow-up, and other trials that are on the horizon. So in order to generate a summary view of the opportunities for comparison or harmonisation, I extracted the measures in the trials and coded them into variable categories. And then this is tabulated. So don't worry, you don't need to read it on this slide, but this is just a visual of how it appears in a much more user-friendly format in the MMCAT online spreadsheet. So what I found was that there was a total of 65 distinct measures that had been utilised across these 6 trials. And whilst that sounds like a lot, consistency of measure selection was actually quite strong. So where 2 studies measured the same variable, they almost always utilised the same measure, which is great. The greatest opportunity for retrospective harmonisation lies in identifying measure commonality across data sets. So this table here shows that you can see all measures that were used in 2 or more of the 6 RCTs that I looked at for this project. So you can see straight away that general distress by the K6+ has been included in every trial. The SDQ has been included in all trials by 1. Patterns of alcohol use, cannabis use, and other drug use have all been measured in at least 4 of the trials, as well as alcohol knowledge. And many of the trials have included measures of adolescents' social relationships, including their ability to resist peer pressure and their experiences of bullying or being bullied, as well as their parental rules and parental control. So straight away from this table, we can see that a strong opportunity exists to harmonise these 6 data sets into one large, highly powered pooled analysis that examines intra-individual and inter-individual change in mental health, substance use and social experiences amongst nearly a whole generation of Australian adolescents. Now, I mentioned that the best opportunities for harmonisation lie in measure commonality. It's not impossible where differing measures have been used, but it just does become a lot more complex and involves a fancy, complex stats procedure called scale equating, which I don't really understand. But in general, as I said, measure commonality was strong across the trials that we have conducted here. The greatest heterogeneity was in the measurement of mental health. And this is likely due to the huge number of psychological measures available and also slight variations in each trial's research objectives, which meant that they suited differing tools. As I mentioned earlier, I extracted the exact wording used in the questionnaires to identify any minor differences that could have implications during harmonisation. It would have been ideal to do this for all 6 RCTs, but for my own sanity, I decided to draw the line at the 3 most recent trials for this project. On face value, the modifications that I found were generally insignificant for harmonisation purposes, such as, there might have been the addition of items which could easily be excluded from pooled analysis, or sometimes there were slight tweaks to wording, changing it from year 9 students to students my age, or things like that, or just to allow for slight clarification. However, there are some modifications that may have implications for harmonisation. So some examples included changing the wording to standard drinks in questions that previously had asked about drinks of alcohol, or most notably changing the time frame referenced in self-report recall measures. So just by way of example, the Rutgers Alcohol Problem Index is a measure used across all 3 of the questionnaires I looked at. But the Health for Life and CSP questionnaires ask respondents to recall the past 12 months when answering the scale, whereas the CSC questionnaire asks about the past 6 months. So all is not lost where these different wordings are used or different timeframes are used. When I was speaking to Tim and Matt on this and doing some reading, I learned about another fancy statistical procedure called moderated nonlinear factor analysis that can be used to determine and mitigate the impact of any wording changes like this and adjust scores accordingly. So just to facilitate this in future harmonisation projects, I noted the wording modifications in the MMCAT, which you can see in the final column there. So the last stage of the review of all of the measures was going to the published literature. So I mentioned this is more for the purpose of prospective harmonisation, because of course for retrospective harmonisation you don't really need to justify the use of measures. But for prospective harmonisation, it's important to know the psychometric properties to make sure that if you're making a selection that could have implications for a number of trials, you're using a measure that has strong validation within the sample that you're looking at. So of the 46 measures that were used in the 3 most recent trials that I examined in detail, 33 were externally developed measures and they had been validated. And then the remaining 13 were custom measures or significantly modified externally developed measures. So of the externally developed measures that we had used, they all had validation studies, and I extracted and saved the psychometric properties into the MMCAT. I also noted the characteristics of the sample in which the measure had been validated. The awesome finding is that the majority of the measures that had been used, bar only a few, had been validated in a sample of adolescents. However, only a third of those had been validated in Australian adolescents, but we all know that's not always feasible or even necessary. So finally, to assist in cross-checking item wording against the original externally developed measure, so this is obviously important for cases where there might be a query on whether wording had been changed and it might impact meaning or anything like that, or even skip logic. I made sure to add a link to the full item bank of each of the measures in their original form where they had been published or where the author was happy to share. So, by way of discussion of and ways to use the MMCAT and some future opportunities, it can answer some common questions that often arise during questionnaire development. So some examples could be, what measures were used in the Health for Life questionnaire? Or where can I find the original item wording and citation for a pre-existing externally developed measure? So where could I find the original wording for the SDQ, for example? What are the psychometric properties of that measure and what samples has it been validated in? So all of those can be found in the MMCAT, and there's more information as well, so you can visit the bit.ly link there. And there are plenty of exciting opportunities for future work in this space. So one example is the Superlearner grant application that Tim presented at the grant development workshop at the end of last year. In that, it proposes the harmonisation of the 6 existing prevention RCT data sets that I talked about, in addition to 2 Canadian data sets as well. We can also consider planning our questionnaires with harmonisation in mind. ensuring that we use the same measures as other large data sets and prioritising validated measures. It would be really great to grow the MMCAT as a resource for the centre. Even just adding the measures to the matrix that I showed on the first slide without doing any of the detailed data extraction will help create a bird's eye view of harmonisation opportunities in the one spot. Then blue sky thinking involves collaboration with other Australian research bodies or other organisations that collect large data sets on adolescent health. So it could be other existing large data sets that have similar outcomes that have ideally been measured using the same measure tools. But also there's an opportunity, like some examples globally, of trying to agree on some key measures for variables that are commonly measured in adolescent health, and trying to sort of create a best practice where those measures are used most frequently to allow for more comparability between data sets, which is especially important in evaluating interventions because, of course, the measure can impact the results. So that is the opportunities, and in a moment we will go through, I'll just click into the MMCAT to just kind of show you how to access it and how to navigate through it. But before we do that, just to test out the interactive feature, if you know how to, or we can try, I don't actually know how to do it, but if you know how to chat and you have been keeping track of how many feline friends have been in this presentation, use your chat feature now on Zoom to submit that, and I will say who's correct. How do I get to it? Oh, okay, so Maddie, you're correct. Tara is correct. Although a lot of people are saying 18, so now I'm wondering if I lost track, but I think it's 17, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it's 17. Excellent. So that worked well. Okay. So we're nearly done with plenty of time to spare, so an early mark, which I'm sure you're all happy about. And 3 dogs, bonus points for Marie. So just to jump into the MMCAT, so you can just use the bit.ly link, so bit.ly/mm-cat. You'll come into this page, and I've checked it using an incognito window, so you shouldn't have any access issues. But if you do, just let me know. Those questions that we went through are listed up front, but it kind of gives you a bit more info, so it tells you which tab to refer to find what you might need. So the measure summary is the one that it would be amazing to continue to grow with other trials. It won't take too long to input measures for your trial into here. And while all of these trials are, universal participants, so it's not a clinical sample or anything like that, it could be cool to start listing studies from other areas of the centre that have more of a clinical sample, because there could be opportunities for comparison, even if it's looking at sort of comparing a general sample with a clinical sample. So if anyone is interested in adding their study measures into here, I think that would be amazing, and it would be cool to keep this as kind of a rolling thing. To protect the sheet from getting really muddled, I've got it locked for editing, but just let me know if you're if you're keen to do that, and I'll grant you access to edit it. So then along the tabs along the bottom, you can see the 3 studies that I went into in a bit more detail. So the 3 most recent studies, so Health for Life being the most recent one. So you can see that the outcome measured is there and the measure name, as well as the wording used in the Matilda Centre trial. And just a kind of a disclaimer, while it's totally fine to use the wording in here, it's probably worth double checking before you submit to ethics or or publish a survey against the original measure or against the RDS version of the survey, just in case anything has changed since I put this together. It also has the response options. You can see the measure reference in APA format. Then I haven't completed the modifications for Health for Life, but for example, with CSP, you can see some modifications to the wording, and you also should be able to add any notes if you want to add anything. I've tried to make it so that that cell is unlocked, but it might not work, so we'll see. Then in terms of the psychometric properties of some of the measures that are used in the 3 trials that I went into in detail, this is a really wordy sheet, but you can see here the general kind of psychometric. This is direct plagiarism, so definitely don't copy paste this. This is for the purposes of just compiling the information, but this is copy pasted from the papers with the reference at the top. And then tables that have reliability and validity information and a hyperlink to the article and any kind of further notes over to the right. And then a kind of a brief summary of the psychometric properties and whether they have been evaluated in an validated in an adolescent sample and whether that was in Australia. So all of that is available in there. So I think that's a wrap.